Good morning, everybody. Welcome to SafeDefend Live. I am Dave Evans with my favorite doctor, Dr. Greg Vecchi, and he's my favorite doctor because he's not a medical doctor and he's not going to make me take medicine I don't want to take. But today we're going to give you some medicine to think about and sources of targeted violence. We're going to relate that to some real world things you deal with every day. So with that, Doc, it's your show, baby.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Good talking to you, Dave. Thanks so much. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, like risk management and things like this, because, when I go to these conferences, these safety conferences, I see a lot of vendors there, and everything's being sold for every single contingency and things like this. And I think one of the realisms, one of the things, the ground truth of this is that there's no way to eliminate all risk. There's going to be needs to do risk mitigation, but there's only so many budgets, only so many people, only so much money, to be able to function with reduced risk. But there's always going to be risk, and that's the bottom line. I mean, you and I were talking about, because you were a pilot in the Air Force,
Yep.
and some of the things that you pointed out, that really it's operational risk management, as you mentioned, right? And it's about taking risk, but they got to be calculated and they got to be mitigated as much as feasible.
Yeah, I think we need to all realize as human beings that nothing is perfect. There is risk associated with everything we do, and the only way not to have any risk in your life and not to put yourself in a place where you may get harmed is you've got to lock yourself in your house, wrap everything with bubble wrap, and shut everything down. And that doesn't work. So the question, and I think the topic of discussion today, is how do we help schools and businesses build a risk mitigation process and an assessment process to understand when to do what, and give them the training so they're comfortable when something bad potentially can happen, like an engine catching fire on the plane, they have a procedure to do to take care of it. Or when they see things getting out of limits, like a part on an airplane or a car, they go, hey, that's out of limits. What's wrong with that person? Do they need help, and how do we help them? Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think two things to kind of compare case study wise, would be the very, very recent shootings at Oklahoma at the football game in Choctaw, and also the shooting at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. All happened here within the last week, right? And so, both involved firearms. And when you're looking online, it's like if you don't know the details, you'd assume they're the same thing, right? Everybody's calling it an active shooter, or something. It's just not really clear. And you look at the details, you can just look at them and realize, well, these aren't the same things. And so if you're looking at risk and probability, you have to look at what's the most probable thing that's going to happen, and put most of your resources there. And of course, you got to be able to expand your resources out. So a couple things that come to mind for me is really understanding the different types of violence. I think that people think, well, someone pulls a gun and shoots, it's all the same violence, and it's really not. So for example, just the situation between those two cases. So the one at the university, clearly, it was a student, it was a graduate student, and he shot his academic advisor, who was a professor in, I think, applied physics there, right? Completely different situation than the football game, where it was outdoor event, obviously, and you had a 15-year-old kid shoot somebody because of an argument, and it seems to be gang related or something like that. And it's still unsure what relationship any of the victims or even the offender has to the school at this
Yep.
point. Not really sure. So you got like two totally different things. So I think that as a superintendent, as a principal, as a CEO at a company, or even a university, a director of university or a chancellor or something like this, you've got your security and your mitigations and things like this, and you got to look at it from the standpoint of, okay, what can we do to prevent it or reduce or mitigate, and then what can we do in the event you can't do it, and you gotta deal with the situation. And we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? The left and right of bank study, preventive versus reactive. But even stepping back from there, I think you have to understand that there are different types of violence. So at the very base level, right, there's this affective versus instrumental violence. And what I mean by that is defensive versus offensive, or fear, reactive, versus predatory. Okay, two very, very different things, right? So if you are sitting around and you get into an argument with someone and it gets heated, and it's kind of like crime of passion type stuff, right? You pull your gun out and shoot the person. That's very different from a calculated predatory approach. There's some research on cats that I was reading, and that's out there in the literature. It's kind of interesting. You got the kitty cat, right, who is protecting. They get scared and they attack in response to being scared, or in response to their babies, their kittens being threatened, or things like that. Versus the lion, who is going to sit back and wait and plan and hold on and wait until the victim gets there, and then he's going to attack, right? So two totally different types of violence. And then if you look at more of the premeditated or targeted violence, which is really what we're talking about here, there's about four different types that can happen in any situation, right? And especially in schools, workplaces, and university campuses, which is really the focus of my examples here. So, like, if you're thinking about the different types of violence, the workplace literature has got it down pat, right? There's basically, four types. You got the stranger violence, one that has no connection with the place of work or school, right? They're not a customer, they're not an employee, they're not a student, they're strangers, right? Kind of like a bank robber, right?
Yep.
And then your second one is more like customer type violence, right? That you would usually get in retail. You've seen this, in the post office in the past, right? The postal shootings. Some were done with customers that were disgruntled, right? In addition to people that actually worked there who were employees, and the ones that worked there who were employees, and the current and former students, when they become violent, that's type 3, right? And then type 4 is violence that is spilled over because of a specific person, like an angry parent coming into the school and being violent, or you got the jealous husband who is in a domestic violence relationship with his girlfriend or wife, and he comes to her place of employment and causes violence. And you got those four types. So I think as an administrator, security person, you got to sit back and say, okay, look, we're not going to be able to stop every single attack or anything like this. But if we want to stay left to bang, what can we do to prevent or mitigate it, or kind of get an idea of what's coming, right? So that's kind of our first area to think about. So if you look at what are the statistics, right? Well, let's look at schools, and I have a chart here. I don't know if you can bring this up for me. It's the one that has 91% on it. Can you see that? So if you look at schools, this is current. 91% of the attacks are going to come from current or former students. Okay. And that means that only 9% is going to be something else. It's going to be a stranger. It's going to be a current or former employee, like a teacher, no relation to school, basically those four types. So here's a question I got for everybody, right? You know that in your area, your environment, 91% of the potential probable most likely violence is going to come from someone you know, specifically a current or former student. Then why are you spending all this money on protecting the outside perimeter from strangers? And that's one of the biggest challenges I see, is there's just a lack of thinking through this to really know what your threat is, right? Now, if you were a bank, this would be a very different pie chart, right? It would be much different. If you're working in a hospital or in a workplace, it's going to be a little bit different. If you're working in a retail situation, the violence potential is going to be very different. And so, using your resources, your limited resources, you got to figure out probabilities, right? And so, when you're thinking about prevention, you're thinking about things like threat assessment, risk management, mitigation procedures and things like this. You should do it and balance it with, okay, where is the most likely threat? Not that we ignore the other ones. We certainly always want to be prepared for the stranger coming in because it could happen in a school, but it's unlikely. But we want to put our resources where the real problem is. And unfortunately, like you mentioned, Dave, if you're going to eliminate risk, you just lock the school up and send everybody home. That's not going to happen. So there is risk. I don't want to say it's acceptable. It's just something we have to deal with, right? And so, using this kind of an approach, rather you're in the workplace, you're in a bank, you work in an Amazon warehouse, or you're working at school, or you're working in the hospital, whatever the situation is at church, these variables are going to be present, but it's going to be different, and you want to plan for that. The other thing I'd like to also say is, so it's on definitions. We go back to the University of North Carolina. So right now we're dealing with this shooting where it happened with a current graduate student. My guess, we don't know the motivation. My guess is there was a grievance there. This student apparently is, I will bet, feels that professor wronged him in some way, shape, or form. It got to the point it was a crisis. They couldn't deal with it anymore, and then they planned and they prepared and they carried out the attack. Right. So that's one thing. Right. And of course, what was it done with? It was done with a handgun. I believe it was a 9mm. Okay. Here's the other issue, though, is that we always talk about active shooters. Well, if a person uses a gun, it's certainly an active shooter. But if a person uses something else, like a knife, it's not going to be an active shooter. It's going to be an active knifer, I guess, if you want to be, technical, right? But you just back it up and say active killer, because it's not really about the tool. It's about their need to kill or use extreme violence to eliminate a grievance that they can't deal with anymore. Now, here's the interesting thing about University of North Carolina. I think people forget that back in 2006, there was an active killer attack there that didn't result in any deaths, but it was a guy who it was a religious ideology, and he tried to run a bunch of people over with a vehicle back in 2006 at the very same campus. And he had a grievance, okay, but it wasn't like directed at a professor. He was a student there, but it was just directed at the fact that it conflicted the school, the people there. In his mind, his perception conflicted with his religious beliefs. Okay, he was a jihadist, right? And so he did it for the ideological reason. So we go back to the motivation. So motivation is going to be about the same. It's just some variations in that. It's going to be usually some sort of a grievance, and that grievance can be described as loss, like loss of relationship, loss of a job. It might be that they feel wronged, that they were wronged by a person or the institution. It could be that they feel persecuted. They were bullied. They were made to feel less important. They were isolated on purpose. Or ideology. It might be religious ideology. It might be environmental. It might be political. It might be some sort of social thing, right, that we see. And so if we kind of step back and look at what this type of violence really is and compare it to the probability of each type to your location, and then here's your preventive and reactive processes and technology based on your limited budget and the probabilities, and I think that we would make some a better progress in dealing with these terrible events.
I agree. And the big thing for me here, and this is for everybody out there, if you're a parent, you're a teacher, you're a business owner, you need to understand the idea of the nearest threat and how to mitigate it. You need to use military terms. You need to have your head on a swivel and know the people around you. I mean, the biggest way to prevent school and workplace violence is to know the people at your school and know the people you work with and know when they're struggling and offer to help them. right?
That's exactly right.
I mean,
That's exactly right.
That slide shows it. We've done so much in the areas of school security to keep bad people out of the school that's no longer an issue for the most part. Fair statement?
Fair statement.
And today, now the issue is internal, right? We've shifted from an external threat to an internal threat for the organization. So the way you deal with an internal threat is you identify the people that are struggling, you know the ones that are having problems, you put eyes on them every day and make sure they're okay, and you get them the help they need before they do something that they can't change.
That's exactly right, because it's also kind of a shift in mindset as far as who the people are that are doing these terrible acts. It's people we know, but it's not only people we know; it's people we love. It's people that are friends. It's people that it's a really hard thing to wrap your head around. It's not that psychopathic serial killer guy that you would expect, right? These are people we know and love who are in crisis. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't deal with them harshly if necessary. We don't deal with that, and doesn't mean that we don't, get them into the criminal justice system and put them in jail or stop them or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that these people are in crisis, and like you just mentioned, get them help them eliminate that crisis. Because if you eliminate the crisis, you eliminate the will to kill, and you actually can stop the violence.
It seems so simple, but we're making it so hard. And we're trying to get gadgets and things to prevent it when all it takes is people that are aware of their surroundings and are willing to say something when they see something.
That's
and
exactly
speak up and speak up before it gets to a point where people are being violent. I mean, the Oklahoma City shooting at Del City the Choctaw football game last week, that was an event that happened, unfortunate, horrible event that happened here in Oklahoma City, and the community's reeling from it, and the schools are putting things in place to mitigate it for this week so we can continue having some normalcy in these high schools. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, it's going to take people being aware of their surroundings and stopping things before they get to a fist fight at the football game, before they get to that confrontation point at a football game or a basketball game or wherever you are. And we need, as adults, we need to start acting like adults.
That's exactly right. Understanding crisis intervention, understanding de-escalation. And here's the fact. It's everyone's responsibility. It's not just the SROs. It's not just the security officer at your workplace or at the football game. It's everyone's responsibility to watch out, look for these warning behaviors, and report them at the very least, if not step up and stop it.
100%. Well, Doc, thanks for your time today. As always, it's a pleasure sitting here talking to you. For everybody out there, please be safe this weekend. It's Labor Day. If you're going to the lake, be careful. If you're driving on the road, be careful. If you're going to a football game this weekend, be careful. Keep your head on a swivel and be safe.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
With that, Doc and I, we're out of here.